Good morning, everybody. Great to be here, and thank you, Daryl, for having us, and thank you for allowing me as an applied ethicist into the room. So I appreciate it, and I know how much work this kind of event requires. It's quite amazing. So kudos to Daryl for really putting this on. I sponsored or hosted a 2-day digital media ethics symposium on campus last week, and it took me a week to recover. So, yeah. So anyway, kudos to Daryl. My name is Patrick Plaisance. I'm from the College of Communications, and I want to start by acknowledging the irony of me standing up here presuming to have something to say about humility. That's not really exercising humility there, but we'll see if I might have something to contribute. This is a project, it's kind of a work-in project or process with Martina Piantoni, who's a doctoral student at Rome, and she was here with me most of the spring semester as a visiting scholar. So we really kind of worked on this project together, kind of diving into humility as a virtue, conceptualizing it, and trying to find ways to increase its application, manifestation, encourage humility-related behaviors in digital life. That's kind of what my real focus and concern is on. So yeah, let's see what you think. And okay, here's a gesture of humility. I'm here more to learn from you than to kind of share any thoughts that I might have on humility. I know there's some philosophers in here who know much more about it than I probably do, but we'll see how it goes. Hope we have a good conversation. And we have seen a real resurgence in humility, in the interest of humility. A lot lately, it seems like that maybe there's an inverse relationship between academic interest in something and the lack of its presence. I don't know, but we have handbooks on the virtue of humility now. We have a lot of scholarship in the last 15 years, both in the realms of virtue theory and social psychology. And indeed, when we talk about personality traits, of course, as it came up yesterday, we have the honesty, humility trait that's been added to the Big Five. So it's popped up in a lot of ways, and it's popped up very specifically for me in the research that I've been involved in. So 10 years ago, I did a pretty lengthy project looking at the moral psychology of exemplars in media, right? Journalists, public relations professionals who are really well respected for their ethical leadership. And I did this big multi-method system where surveying them and getting a moral psychology profile, but also conducting a series of structured interviews, right? Their life stories. And one thing that shocked me, that surprised me, was the emergence of this theme of humility that came out of those life stories. I expected just to kind of dispense with the life story data in a chapter or two, and no, it took 3 or 4 or 5 chapters actually to explore those themes. One of which was humility, and that did surprise me how often it came up. More recently, I've been involved in a longitudinal study of emerging adults across the country moving into the media workspace, moving into media industries, journalism, media marketing, advertising, PR. And again, that humility has popped up in kind of a surprising way in our data. There was a strong correlation between the honesty, humility trait and idealistic thinking. And then, of course, and then later on, more recently, a study I did with public relations exemplars showed the same correlation, and it showed a correlation with between honesty and humility trait and the harm foundation. of MFT. So there's something going on here, and it just kind of prompted me to take a deeper dive into the idea of humility. And so in my field of applied ethics, it seems to me we have a real need for an explication of humility, and that's what Martina and I really sought to do. Part of that is we want to argue that the popular understanding of humility, I think, is incomplete, and we suggest that humility is some sort of foundational value. And I know that language is kind of contested, and we can talk about that. I've heard talk of the existence of meta virtues. I'm not even sure what that might be, but I hope we have more of a conversation about that. And then, of course, explore ways how humility might be encouraged, cultivated, right, in our digital behavior. So media ethicists and theorists have long wrestled with the dilemma of social media toxicity, of course. That's a big concern of mine. We have a long list of prescriptions and proposals to encourage civility. Some of them work, some of them seem to be ignored. And much of this scholarship is driven by neo-Aristotelian virtue theory perspectives, and we agree with that. I consider myself very much a virtue ethicist. And we know that the corrosive nature of so much of social media cannot be addressed, I think, without a systematic explication of the virtue of humility, and without deliberate pragmatic strategies to encourage its implementation. I think key elements of humility include a heightened self-awareness, a perspective, an attentiveness to others. These have been mentioned before, all of which are critical for a flourishing environment. And I suggest that even humility-related behaviors can usher in self-awareness and maybe even transcendence. So, the etymology of humility, of course, most of us know, goes back to the Latin humilitas, which suggests that humility is a state of pleasant simplicity of mind, characterized by an acceptance of one's own insignificance in the grand scheme of things. In other words, a lack of protagonism. Even before the Christian era, we saw an evolution of what came to be known as humility. But most of us understand the version of humility that is firmly grounded in Christian theology, where humans, in relation to God and the cosmic order, must remain humble, acknowledging their smallness, and accepting their radical dependence, right? And this idea of smallness, I think, is an important strain in how people talk about humility, which I'd like to kind of push against. For Plato, sophrosone was a fundamental virtue associated with inner harmony and balance, and it's often been translated as this combination of temperance, self-control, and practical wisdom. In the Republic, courage, wisdom, and sophrosone were the three primary virtues of the soul, and it's connected to the ideas of quietness, of modesty, and of self-knowledge, all of which I think mirror elements of humility. So we've seen this evolution, and even despite the absence of humility in Aristotle and other works, it was a significant aspect of the Greek ethos. As the ancient Greeks from Homer to Socrates understood, a fundamental aspect of being human was to recognize one's limitations and avoid hubris, right? So that's a central element of humility, even though it may not have been explicitly stated in many of the classical works. And it was not until the advent of Christianity, of course, that humility began to be more explicitly valued as a positive trait, right? So the virtue of humility occupies a central place in Augustine's theology. He defines it as a fundamental virtue that enables humans to recognize their created status and limitations before God, right? It's also defined as the antidote that deflates ambition, and humility is seen as the opposite of pride, which of course is considered a root of original sin. And then Aristotle comes along, blocking my little picture of thumbnail of Aristotle, but that's okay. I'm sorry, Aquinas. He emphasizes that humility is understood as a recognition of one's dependence on God, but is not incompatible with great deeds, right? He contends that humility, by curbing impetuous desires, is integral to the virtue of temperance. So for Aquinas, humility alongside justice, prudence, and fortitude is one of the cardinal virtues. Of course, later on, we find positions that are diametrically opposed to this Christian sense of humility. David Hume, for instance, says that there's no virtue in humility, and he categorized it as one of the monkish virtues, right? A group of traits, he says, is detrimental to human flourishing. These traits, according to Hume, undermine self-esteem and diminish what he called the pleasure of life. As he stated in a treatise on human nature, pride produces pleasure, humility produces pain. Humility is shame, not satisfaction, of our looks, skills, positions, and accomplishments. And then, of course, Nietzsche comes along and further complicates the notion of humility as a virtue. For him, humility is synonymous with weakness and is seen as an impediment to the full realization of the individual, right? Which, of course, is a key part of his whole critique of Christian morality. So what is the optimal conceptualization of humility that this all leads us to? Many theorists seem to converge on a cluster of traits to describe this virtue, right? A lack of arrogance, domination, knowledge of limits, a smallness, right? Nancy Snow, Julia Driver, Roberts, Jason Baer all talk about humility in different but similar ways, right? As Roberts said, humility can best be defined as a family of lacks, right? A lack of hubris, a lack of arrogance. And those are helpful, but I think Jennifer Wright is the one who offers the most compelling and comprehensive and relevant definition or conceptualization for us. Jennifer Wright, a few years ago, talked about or tried to redefine humility as what she called an epistemically and ethically aligned state of awareness and an ability to set aside the natural centeredness. And I love that word, and I'll talk about that a little later, centeredness of our phenomenological and our psychological self. And I hate to throw extended quotes at people, but I'm going to do that here because I think this is so valuable. She says, being able to do all the things required for maturely virtuous engagement requires that the maturely virtuous person is able to cognitively and effectively experience and appreciate that significance. The weight, as it were, of the many different features of a situation, many of which are not her own and are external to her, that contribute to the determination of the appropriate response in a given instance. Right? So this requires, she says, at its foundation, the absence, or at least the temporary quieting of interfering or distorting influences. And I think Wright's vision of humility as a sort of freedom, right? Once you quiet your own impulses and allow yourself to kind of apprehend other realities outside of you, that sort of freedom, I think, is really compelling. So we're able, she says, to escape the centripetal forces of our own natural centeredness and the biases that arise from it, and thus we're able to genuinely experience the pull of others' needs, desires, and interests, right? Becoming kind of closer to humanity, right? So that, I find that very compelling, this idea of humility, not kind of making me smaller, right? Focused on self-abnegation, but this freeing of myself from my own impulses so that I can apprehend other realities, right? I think that's very compelling, and I think that has some real use for us applied ethicists in media and other fields when we want to think about how to encourage or cultivate humility, right? So instead of framing humility as kind of a family of lacks, right? I'm in Wright's camp totally by framing it as a state of enlightened agency. And I also want to suggest that humility has a lot of links, maybe unexplored links with curiosity. specifically with the Augustinian notion of studiositas, right? And this, in turn, has, I think, some really important connections to be explored with the notion of self-improvement, which is a call from philosophers from all stripes, deontologists, virtue ethicists, all have a call and focus on this obligation that we have for self-improvement. And we also, in this project, Martina and I are also kind of exploring how both of these, maybe the link between humility and curiosity, and how they might kind of actually serve as two twin foundational virtues, how we need to articulate them in any kind of phronetic modeling, right? So a lot of interesting work going on with phronesis and people involved with trying to come up with phronetic models for cultivating phronesis, right? Christensen and Vaccarezza and others are doing some interesting work here. So I think humility and curiosity really need to be at the forefront of this kind of phronetic modeling. Also, I'm very interested in how we might better explore correlations among curiosity-related traits and humility, right? So need for cognition levels. We know that high NFC people differ in how they approach different things or are attracted to different types of stories than low NFC people, right? And we know that they have those levels have an effect on other behaviors and other states, right? And so how can we might more systematically explore that connection with humility-related dispositions as well? And I think there's more there. So what I'd like to do is find ways to suggest how we can implement strategies to cultivate humility, right? To answer questions like the ones Iris Murdoch poses, right? The picture of ourselves has become distorted, right? And so how do we address that? How do we address that? And there's things to talk about here. The architecture of social media, and I talk about this quite a bit in my social media ethics spiel in my classes and in other talks. We know that the design of social media platforms privileges some discourse, some types of discourse, and marginalizes others, right? It privileges proclamation, it privileges monologic, right, discourse, and rather than true exchange, true dialogue, right? And so what are some ways that we can address that, and in ways that are informed, right, by this focus on humility and curiosity. I have a separate paper and talk on curiosity itself, which led me to humility, really. And so I see the two as very connected. And I think it might be the case that some strategies that we can use to cultivate curiosity and bolster curious thinking may actually have the same effect or similar effect with humility-related virtue behavior. And we know that people with humility features, right, are more likely to exhibit better psychological outcomes. They're more likely to exhibit traits of openness. They're more likely to be able to prioritize others, to show good listening skills. Humility seems to increase happiness overall. It seems to strengthen relationships. It seems to maximize professional success, right? So all of these are worth pursuing. So how can we encourage more humility-related behaviors online? And so what I'd like to do is kind of throw out 3 areas where Martina and I have been thinking about that seem promising, some initiatives that are ongoing that seem promising. So the first one is initiatives or efforts to practice generosity in discourse. Practice generosity in discourse. And there's several people who are actually trying to do this. Loretta Ross, who's an activist in the country, has has a project, has an initiative that she's talked about, which she refers to as calling in, right? And this is to counter what she sees and what we all see as a corrosive cancel culture, right? So we tend to call out people who disagree with us, who we think we're wrong, right? And she's kind of trying to turn that around and offering these sessions online to cultivate this attitude of calling in, right? Engaging people in different ways who might disagree with you, and how to do that. And she's not the only one to do that. There's several. Rob Willer is doing a similar thing, talking about how can we have better political conversations, and I think those are helpful. Second one is practicing critical thinking, right? So we know that social media, among other things, it invites complacency. It invites passivity, and so we know that people who rely on their social media feeds for their news, for example, right, tend to be more gullible about misinformation. They tend to be low information voters. They tend to have more extreme political views, right? So how can we cultivate more engagement, more critical thinking to move against that, right? And so I've been talking a lot about strategies to try to move the needle a little bit on the volume. 60% of Americans now tend to rely on their social media feed for their news, right? And so that's huge. And so if, we don't want to be part of the problem. And so how can we encourage news presentation, news framing, right? To kind of move people out of that and engage them and attract them to good journalism, which is out there, right? When people just don't choose to pursue it or pay for it, for sure. And then the third one is I'm taking the language again from Loretta Ross. I'm sorry, not Loretta Ross, but who talks a little bit about this, but Jennifer Wright, right? Her redefinition of humility, right? Rethinking and broadening our own centeredness. And there's actually some really interesting initiatives going on in different corners of the web. There's a lot of different plugins that are available now to interrupt our social media feeds, right? To say, hey, here's something that is not not representative of what your network is seeing, but might be worthwhile anyway, right? Another thing I want to really talk about here is generative AI. The potential here to use chatbots in a real powerful way. And Taya mentioned some of your comments yesterday. I think were really relevant to me or compelling to me. I've been a pretty strong critic of generative AI, and spent a lot of time talking about and writing about the moral questions raised by generative AI, including environmental issues, the real dangers, I think, of blind anthropomorphic designs. There's all the list of ethical questions goes on and on. But here, I think there might be some real possibilities. The way that we're seeing generative chatbots being developed is rather than having large language models based on indiscriminately huge data sets, right? We can tailor them based on data sets that are verified, that are pre-screened in different ways, right? And maybe we can use that kind of emerging technology trend to think about prompts, to think about cautions, to engage people in their social media discourse, right? Have you thought about this, right, before you post or whatever? And so I think that's something that chatbots actually, if we continue to go to this kind of more customized design of large language models, right, that might be really, really helpful. The Washington Post actually has rolled out a chatbot. It's called Climate Answers, and it's a chatbot just trained on their archive of climate news. And so that's to me a really good example of kind of the more focused application of chatbots that are useful in specific cases, right? And it says if you give it a prompt that it's not able to pull from that database, it will tell you, I don't know, right? So I think that's really valuable. So there's ways that we can, I think more seriously about strategies that could cultivate, hopefully, foreground humility-related behaviors, maybe ways to model it in more commonly. But I'm really looking forward to some suggestions that you might have, some thoughts, because as I said, this is still a work in progress. So thank you very much for your time. I saw a hand over there first, so.
Yep. Should I need the mic?
Yeah.
Thank you.
I need that.
All right, I'll give it back to you. It seems like it's easy to think that humility is a virtue. It sounds good. You know, picture somebody who's humble about the right things. But it seems like if humility is a virtue, it needs to be, being humble about the right things. And it seems to be an issue both for encouraging humility and for measuring humility. So I'm thinking about somebody like Tucker Carlson interviewing Putin, and Putin says, blames Poland for World War II, and Tucker Carlson says, oh, interesting, of course. That's, I guess, in a sense, if you look just at seeing humility, but maybe not the kind of humility we would want to encourage. So how do you incorporate the idea about when we ought to be humble, or when we want people to be humble, into the definition and the encouragement and the measurement of humility?
I totally agree. And the question of false virtue is a chronic one, right? So you can say that for just about any virtue, right? An disingenuous, right, application of virtue is going to always be a problem. I like Lisa. Right, yeah. There you are. I think your comment was really important when it came to never losing sight of the human in any kind of design or policy, and so that's always going to be a challenge, right? If we are going to find ways and experiment with different kinds of social media prompt systems or interventions in feeds, for example, right? How to minimize the possibility of misuse, right, or abuse. I'm not sure. I'm not sure how to do that. Other than more discourse, right? I think that's always going to be important. But you're right. The danger of false virtue, of false signaling, is always going to be dangerous. The danger is dangerous. Sorry. Yeah, other questions? I see one.
Hi, so all this sounds good. I'm not sure how it gets implemented. So I'll just pick one example. Encourage critical thinking. How do you actually do that in the population?
Yeah. Good question. And this speaks more to my work that I've been doing on curiosity, so I hate to kind of veer away from humility, but we know, say, for example, people are drawn, first of all, we want to engage, right? We want to maximize engagement, but we also want to cultivate good behaviors. And so when it comes to curiosity, we know that people with high NFC respond to stories, to types of framing in ways that are different from people with low NFC. So for example, people with high NFC, high need for cognition, are really drawn and easily engaged by stories that are puzzle-like, that are kind of have an element of mystery or suspense, right? And that engages them in a high degree. you do not get people with low NFC with stories that are framed as a puzzle, for example. What people with low NFC are drawn to and will be willing to engage with are stories that are personable, that are framed, focused on a single individual, right, and telling their story, right? That's what tends to get low NFC people to engage, right? And so you need to meet people where they are, in a way, but also I think you can maximize people's likelihood, right, by repeated exposure to different framing, right, to maybe move that NFC needle a little bit. Curiosity is just like empathy. It's a muscle, right, that needs to be cultivated. It's not like we are born with or without it, right? And so strategies to get people to exercise that muscle, I think, that's what we're after. And I'm not sure what the right answers are, but I think those answers will also help us with humility-related behaviors as well.
So I think if anyone else has questions, let's bring them to the panel. But
Go.
move on to Rosie's talk. But thank you very much.